Tonight we're on the Great Lakes shoreline, where fog moves low, ore dust hangs in the air, and the docks sound different after the last shift clears out. Flood lamps pulse through drifting haze, bubblers hiss in empty slips, and long steel hulls groan like they're trying to settle deeper into the cold water. A range light drifts between retired towers even though the power's been off for years. Footsteps cross iced planks above active bubblers with no prints in the snow dust. Channel chatter repeats a lineup from last winter, flat carrier tone and all. And a barge in skim ice corrects its own list right after a siren circles under the surface. Everything tonight comes from harbor logs, VHF captures, security rounds, and late-season notes written long after tourist hours end. And if you're new here, subscribe so you don't miss our daily true horror stories. We post every night. Tell us where you're watching from and what time it is. Your comments help push this series forward and keep these investigations alive. All right, let's get into it. I was on the night shift, monitoring the harbor systems. It was late winter, the air thick with a dense, cold fog. I noticed a light where no light should have been. My job as a harbor technician involved overseeing the automated systems for vessel traffic and port security. The control room was a small, insulated cabin, overlooking the main channel where the river met the lake. Most nights were routine, especially during the colder months when commercial traffic slowed significantly. The usual hum of the equipment and the distant groan of the ore docks were the only constant sounds. I would check the AIS for incoming vessels, scan the security cameras, and log any minor incidents. The isolation of the night shift was something I had grown accustomed to over the years. The cold outside was a constant presence, even through the thick windows. The frost often coated the glass, blurring the already dim view of the breakwalls and the decommissioned range lights. This particular night, the fog was exceptionally heavy. It swallowed the flood lamp haze from the docks, reducing visibility to a few dozen yards. I was reviewing the camera feeds, cycling through the static-laced images, when I saw it. A steady, white light, distinct and unwavering, appeared in the channel. It was positioned roughly between the two old, inactive range towers that marked the outer edge of the river mouth. These structures had been dark for years, their beacons removed. The light was too low to be an aircraft, and too high to be a small craft's running light. It held its position for several minutes, a stark, unnatural glow in the impenetrable gray. I checked the AIS. The screen was clear, showing no targets within a wide radius. I ran a quick diagnostic on the system, but everything registered as normal. The light remained, a silent, unmoving presence. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, it vanished, leaving only the oppressive fog. I made a note in the logbook, detailing the observation and the lack of corresponding data. I attributed it to a trick of the fog, perhaps a distant reflection, or a momentary glitch in my vision. About an hour later, the light reappeared. This time, it was closer to the eastern breakwall, still between the old towers but noticeably shifted. It was a single strong white light, not flashing, not sweeping, just a constant, unwavering point. The fog was still incredibly dense, muffling all sound. I zoomed the nearest camera, but the image was too grainy, too obscured by the haze to resolve any detail beyond the light itself. What struck me was its movement. It seemed to drift slowly against the prevailing wind, which was a light but steady push from the northwest. Objects in the fog usually appeared to move with the wind, or at least be anchored against it. This light was moving subtly in the opposite direction, a slow, deliberate glide. I checked the AIS again. Still nothing. The channel was empty. I tried the VHF radio, hailing any vessel in the area, but received only static in response. The air in the cabin felt colder, despite the thermostat holding steady. I could hear the faint hiss of ice forming on the outer panes of the windows. I watched the light for what felt like a long time, perhaps 20 minutes. It maintained its steady, unnatural drift. Then, the harbor's main foghorn sounded. It was a deep, flat tone, unusually long and drawn out, not the typical rhythmic blast. It resonated through the metal structure of the cabin, a low vibration that seemed to settle in my chest. As the horn's sound faded, I noticed something else on the security monitor. The timestamp in the corner of the camera feed, which usually updated every second, was skipping. It would jump forward by several seconds, then correct itself, then jump again. It was erratic, not a consistent lag. I checked other cameras. The same skipping was happening across the entire system. The audio feed from the external microphones also registered a strange, low hum, barely audible beneath the foghorn's echo. It was not the familiar hum of the machinery. It was something else, a deeper, more resonant vibration. The light, meanwhile, continued its slow, impossible drift, seemingly unaffected by the horn or the strange electrical anomalies. It was a beacon under fog, but a beacon without a source. I contacted dispatch, relaying my observations in a calm, procedural tone. I described the light, its unusual movement, the lack of AIS data, and the camera system's erratic behavior. Dispatch acknowledged the report, suggesting it might be a reflection from a distant shorelight or an atmospheric phenomenon. They advised me to continue monitoring and to log everything. I knew it was more than that. I pulled up the harbor logs from the previous shifts, looking for any similar incidents. There was nothing. I checked the sensor readouts for electromagnetic interference, but the readings were within normal parameters. The light persisted, a silent challenge to every instrument I had. I decided to conduct a visual inspection from the nearest accessible point along the breakwall. I grabbed my heavy coat, a flashlight, and my handheld radio. The cold outside was immediate, a sharp bite that cut through my layers. The fog was so thick I could barely see the gravel path in front of me, even with the flashlight beam. The walk along the breakwall was slow and deliberate. The air was heavy, damp and still. The only sounds were my own footsteps and the distant muffled resonance of the lake against the concrete. The fog swallowed the light from my flashlight, creating a small, moving sphere of visibility. I could feel the frost crunching under my boots. I kept my eyes on the direction where I had seen the light, but the density of the fog made it impossible to discern anything beyond a few yards. The silence was profound, broken only by the occasional drip of moisture from the unseen structures around me. I reached a point where I could normally see the old range towers, but they were completely obscured. I stood there for a long moment, listening, watching. The low hum I had heard on the audio feed seemed to be present in the air around me, a faint, almost imperceptible vibration that settled in my ears. It was not a sound I could easily identify. It felt like the air itself was resonating. I turned back towards the cabin, the feeling of isolation intensifying with every step. The light was gone when I returned to the control room. The camera feeds were still skipping, but the strange hum had faded from the audio. I spent the rest of the shift reviewing the recorded footage, trying to find any additional evidence. The light appeared in several frames, always steady, always moving against the wind. The skipping timestamps made it difficult to establish a precise timeline, but the visual evidence was clear. I compiled a detailed report, attaching the relevant log entries and the fragmented camera footage. I noted the unusual foghorn blast and the persistent, unidentifiable hum. The official response was inconclusive. The report was filed, marked as an unexplained atmospheric event. There was no evidence of a vessel, no debris, no further incidents. The harbor returned to its usual quiet routine in the following days. The fog eventually lifted, revealing the familiar, empty channel. I continued my shifts, monitoring the systems, but the memory of that night remained. The image of that steady white light, drifting against the wind, is still clear in my mind. I sometimes hear that flat, long tone of the foghorn, even when the air is still and clear. I was the night shift harbor technician, monitoring the Great Lakes Marina. It was late November, the air barely above freezing, and a thick fog had rolled in. The first unusual event was a sudden, brief spike in the power grid. My shift had started just after sundown, and the marina was quiet, as it always was during the colder months. Most of the pleasure craft had been hauled out weeks ago, leaving only a few hardy fishing vessels and the larger workboats in their slips. The bubbler system, designed to prevent ice formation around the docks, was running its steady hum. This hum was a constant, low thrum that vibrated through the metal gangways and the concrete pilings. The fog was dense, reducing visibility to only a few yards, even with the floodlights cutting through it. Their beams created hazy cones of light that struggled to penetrate the heavy moisture. The air carried the damp scent of lake water and the faint metallic tang of the ore docks further down the shore. I was in the main office cabin, reviewing the automated systems logs. The power spike registered on the console as a momentary blip, too short to trigger any alarms but distinct enough to catch my attention. It was an unusual occurrence for the stable grid that powered our facility. I made a mental note to check the substation logs later, assuming it was just a minor fluctuation from the main line. The silence of the night was otherwise unbroken, save for the distant, flat tone of a foghorn from the main shipping channel. My routine on these winter nights was predictable. I would patrol the docks every few hours, checking the bubbler lines for blockages and ensuring the mooring lines were secure. The security cameras provided a constant feed, though the fog often rendered them less effective. I also monitored the AIS system for any vessel movements in the channel, and the VHF radio for any distress calls. The marina was a ghost town in winter, a stark contrast to the bustling summer months. The only sounds were the wind, the lapping of the water, and the mechanical hum of the bubblers. My cabin was warm, a small island of light and warmth against the vast, cold night. I had a thermos of coffee and a stack of maintenance reports to review. The isolation was a part of the job, something I had grown accustomed to over the years. It was a quiet solitude, often punctuated only by the distant rumble of a freight train on the highway, or the occasional flash of headlights on the gravel access road. The cold was a constant presence, seeping into everything, even through the thick walls of the cabin. About an hour after the power blip, I heard it. A distinct sound like footsteps coming from Dock 3. I was in the cabin sipping coffee when the sound registered. It was a rhythmic, deliberate pacing, a heavy tread on the wooden planks. My first thought was that a fisherman had decided to brave the fog, or perhaps a late-arriving workboat crew. But Dock 3 was empty, its slips vacant. I checked the security monitor for that section. The camera feed was a hazy, indistinct gray, the fog too thick for any clear image. I could barely make out the outlines of the pilings. The audio feed, however, was clear. I turned up the volume. The sound was unmistakable, a steady thump, 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 moving along the dock. It was a heavy, measured pace, not a hurried one. The bubbler lines ran beneath the surface of the water, creating a constant hiss where the open water met the forming ice. The footsteps seemed to pass directly over these iced planks, right where the water was kept from freezing solid. This meant the person, or whatever it was walking on a thin, unstable layer of ice, or perhaps on the very edge of the dock where the bubblers were less effective. I found this odd. No one would intentionally walk on such precarious footing in the dark, especially not in this dense fog. The sound continued for several minutes, moving from the shore end of Dock 3 towards the breakwall. It reached the end of the dock, paused for a moment, and then turned, beginning its return journey. The rhythm was unwavering, a slow, deliberate march. I grabbed my heavy coat and flashlight. I needed to investigate. This was outside the normal parameters of marina activity. As I stepped out of the cabin, the cold hit me, a sharp, biting air that seemed to cut through my clothes. The fog was even thicker now, a suffocating blanket. I walked quickly towards Dock 3, my own footsteps echoing unnaturally in the muffled night. The sound of the pacing continued, growing louder as I approached. It was just ahead of me, perhaps 50 yards away. I could hear the faint hiss of the bubblers beneath the sound of the steps. I called out, my voice swallowed by the fog. "Hello? Is anyone there?" There was no reply, but the footsteps continued their steady cadence. I reached the entrance to Dock 3. The floodlights cast a weak, diffused glow. I swept my flashlight beam across the planks. There was a thin dusting of fresh snow that had fallen earlier in the evening, barely an inch deep. It was undisturbed. There were no footprints, not a single mark in the pristine snow. Yet the sound of heavy footsteps persisted, moving away from me now, towards the breakwall again. I stood there, flashlight beam cutting through the fog, listening to the impossible sound. The thump, thump, thump was clear, distinct, and undeniably present. It was moving over the snow-dusted planks, over the iced sections where the bubblers hissed. My mind struggled to reconcile what I was hearing with what I was seeing. The lack of any visual evidence was deeply unsettling. The sound reached the end of the dock once more, paused, and then began its slow, deliberate return. I stood frozen for a few moments, the cold seeping into my bones. The rhythmic footsteps were approaching me again, growing louder with each beat. My flashlight beam continued to cut through the fog, searching for any anomaly, any explanation. There was nothing, just the undisturbed snow, the dark water, and the relentless sound. I backed away slowly, my heart beginning to pound against my ribs. This was not a person. It could not be. A person would leave prints. A person would respond. I retreated to the relative safety of the main office cabin, my eyes fixed on the empty dock. Once inside, I immediately checked the security camera feed for Dock 3 again. The visual was still a hazy gray, but the audio was still active. The footsteps were now directly in front of the camera's field of view, the sound loud and clear. I watched the screen, listening intently. Then, without warning, the audio feed cut out. Not a static burst, not a crackle, but a complete, abrupt silence. The video feed remained, a grainy, indistinct image of the fog-shrouded dock, but the sound was gone. I tried to reactivate the audio, toggling the settings, but it remained muted. It was as if the system had simply decided to stop transmitting sound from that specific location. I checked the other cameras. All other audio feeds were working perfectly, picking up the hum of the bubblers, the distant foghorn, the gentle lapping of water against the hulls. Only Dock 3 was silent. I pulled up the system logs for the camera. There was no error message, no indication of a malfunction. The system simply registered the audio channel as inactive. This was not a typical technical glitch. I felt a cold dread begin to settle in my stomach. This was beyond a simple power blip or a misidentified fisherman. I decided to make a report to dispatch. I picked up the radio, my hand slightly trembling. I kept my voice steady, relaying the details of the incident. The power spike, the footsteps, the lack of prints, the camera audio muting itself. The dispatcher, a calm voice named Sarah, listened patiently. She suggested it might be an electrical short in the camera's microphone, or perhaps an animal. I explained the nature of the footsteps, the deliberate pacing, the weight implied by the sound. An animal, even a large one, would not produce such a consistent, heavy tread, nor would it leave no prints in fresh snow. She agreed it was unusual and said she would log it. She offered to send a patrol car, but I declined. What would they find? Empty docks and an uncooperative camera. I spent the rest of the night in the cabin, monitoring the feeds, occasionally checking the Dock 3 camera. The audio remained muted. The visual remained a hazy gray. I did not hear the footsteps again, not directly, but the silence from that specific dock was more unnerving than the sound had been. The isolation of the night felt heavier, the cold more pervasive. I kept the cabin lights on full, and the radio tuned to a local station, just for the human voices. I reviewed the harbor logs for any similar incidents, but found nothing. The night stretched on, long and unnerving. When my relief arrived at dawn, the fog had begun to lift, revealing a gray, overcast sky. The marina was still and silent. I briefed him on the incident, trying to keep my tone as factual as possible. He listened, his expression unreadable, and then went to check the Dock 3 camera himself. He confirmed the audio was still inactive. We walked out to Dock 3 together. The thin layer of snow was still undisturbed. There were no prints, no signs of anything out of place. The bubblers hissed gently, keeping the water open. I filed a detailed report, including the power spike data and the camera logs. The official explanation was a probable electrical fault in the camera's audio circuit, possibly exacerbated by the cold and fog. The lack of footprints was attributed to the light snowfall and the possibility of wind blowing them away, though I knew that was unlikely given the density of the snow and the weight of the implied steps. The incident was logged, filed, and eventually forgotten by most. The camera's audio was eventually restored a few days later, after a technician replaced a component, though he found no obvious fault with the original. I still work the night shift at the marina. The bubblers still hum, and the fog still rolls in sometimes. Every now and then, when the conditions are just right, a heavy fog, a thin layer of fresh snow, and the deep quiet of the night, I find myself listening. I listen for that specific rhythm, that heavy, deliberate pace. I listen for the sound of footsteps on iced planks, where open water hisses. I know what I heard, and I know what I didn't see. The memory of that night remains. A quiet, unsettling presence in the isolation of the dark. I was monitoring the port's automated systems from my small cabin. It was a cold, clear night in late winter, the air sharp with frost. A faint, almost imperceptible hum registered on the VHF receiver, even though no vessel was transmitting. My job as a harbor tech involved overseeing the automated loading operations and monitoring all port communications. The ore docks stretched out into the black water, a skeletal structure of steel and concrete under the distant floodlamp haze. Most nights were quiet, a steady rhythm of machinery and the occasional distant foghorn flat tone. I had been on the night shift for several years, accustomed to the isolation and the quiet hum of the equipment. The port was mostly automated, requiring minimal human presence after the last freighter departed. My primary responsibility was to ensure the systems ran smoothly and to log any anomalies. I kept a close watch on the AIS transponders, the security cameras, and the various audio feeds from around the facility. The hum on the VHF was unusual, a low, steady carrier wave without any discernible voice. It was a minor detail, easily dismissed as atmospheric interference or a distant, weak signal. I made a brief note in the digital logbook, then returned my attention to the cargo flow readouts. The air outside the cabin was barely above freezing, and a thin layer of frost had begun to form on the windows. My routine was precise, a sequence of checks and cross-references. Every hour, I would cycle through the main security camera feeds, ensuring no unauthorized movement along the breakwalls or near the decommissioned range lights. I would then review the sensor readouts from the conveyor belts and the loading chutes. The ore docks were a massive, intricate system, designed for efficiency and bulk. Even in the dead of night, the underlying mechanisms maintained a low, constant hum. The only sounds were the distant lapping of water against the pilings and the occasional creak of metal in the cold. I would also check the weather reports, especially for any incoming fog or ice. Winter marinas nearby were locked down, their boats shrink-wrapped and silent. The gravel path leading to my cabin was usually undisturbed, save for the tracks of the occasional maintenance vehicle. This particular night had started like many others, a predictable progression of tasks under the silent watch of the night sky. Around an hour after the initial hum, the VHF radio crackled again. This time, a voice emerged from the static. It was faint, almost a whisper, but distinct enough to catch my attention. The voice began listing a sequence of call signs and vessel names, followed by specific berth numbers. I recognized the format immediately. It was the standard lineup for the previous day's loading shift, the one that had concluded just before midnight. I checked the AIS display. There were no vessels currently approaching or docked at the berths mentioned. All active freighters were well out in the lake, their transponders showing their positions many miles away. The voice continued, calm and monotonous, reciting the names of ships that had departed hours ago. I leaned closer to the radio, adjusting the squelch. The signal was strong, a clear carrier wave, but the voice itself seemed distant, almost disembodied. It was not a live broadcast. It sounded like a recording, but one being played over an active channel. I checked the harbor logs for the previous shift. The call signs and berth numbers matched precisely. Every detail was accurate, down to the specific type of ore each vessel was scheduled to load. I tried to hail the channel, but received no response. The voice simply continued its recitation, oblivious. I switched through other channels, finding only the usual quiet. When I returned to the original channel, the voice was still there, repeating the same sequence. It was a loop, I realized, playing the same information over and over. This was highly irregular. No one would broadcast a stale loading schedule on an active channel, especially not in a loop. I accessed the port's internal audio recording system, which continuously logs all VHF traffic. I initiated a manual recording of the channel, capturing the strange broadcast. The cold outside seemed to press in on the cabin, and I felt a subtle chill despite the heater running. The flood lamp haze outside seemed to thicken, blurring the edges of the ore docks. The voice continued for about 20 minutes, then abruptly ceased. The channel went silent, leaving only a faint, residual static. I reviewed the recording I had just made. The voice was clear, the information precise. I cross-referenced the call signs with the incident log from last January. A few of the vessels mentioned in the broadcast had been involved in a minor collision near the breakwalls during a heavy fog event that winter. One of the ships had sustained hull damage, causing a significant delay in port operations. It was a detail that stood out, a specific memory from a particularly difficult shift. The coincidence felt unsettling. I tried to rationalize it, thinking perhaps a maintenance crew was testing old equipment, but that made little sense. No one would use live channels for such a test, and certainly not with outdated information. As I was reviewing the logs, the main conveyor belt system, which had been idle, suddenly tripped. The entire structure shuddered with a deep metal resonance. Alarms blared briefly on my console, then silenced as the system went into emergency shutdown. This was a significant event. A conveyor trip without cause was rare, especially when the system was not actively running. I immediately pulled up the sensor readouts for the conveyor. All indicators showed a sudden, unexplained surge in motor torque, followed by an immediate shutdown. There was no physical obstruction detected, no power fluctuation, and no mechanical failure reported by the diagnostics. The system simply stopped, as if an invisible hand had thrown the emergency switch. The ice hiss from the lake outside seemed to grow louder in the sudden silence that followed the alarm. I contacted dispatch, reporting the unusual VHF broadcast and the conveyor trip. Dispatch confirmed they had also detected the carrier wave on the VHF, but their recording showed no discernible voice, only static. This was perplexing. My internal recording clearly had the voice. Dispatch initiated a review of all port security camera footage and audio mics from the area of the conveyor belt. They also sent a maintenance crew to inspect the conveyor system physically. I felt a growing sense of unease. The cold outside seemed to seep into the cabin despite the heater. The isolation of the night shift, usually a comfort, now felt like a vulnerability. I kept the VHF radio on, listening intently, but the channel remained silent. The flood lamps cast long, distorted shadows across the empty docks. The maintenance crew reported no visible damage or obstruction to the conveyor system. They ran diagnostics, finding no faults. The system was reset and brought back online without issue. Meanwhile, dispatch reviewed the security camera footage. The cameras showed nothing unusual around the conveyor at the time of the trip. No person, no animal, no falling debris. The audio mics picked up the sound of the trip itself, the metal resonance, but nothing leading up to it. The official report noted, "Cause undetermined for the conveyor trip." The discrepancy with the VHF recording was more difficult to explain. Dispatch's central recording system, a more robust and redundant setup than my local unit, showed only a strong carrier signal with no voice. My recording, however, clearly contained the whispered list of old ship names. I provided my recording to dispatch. Their technicians analyzed it, comparing it to their own. They confirmed the presence of the voice on my file, but could not explain why their system had not captured it. They theorized a localized atmospheric condition, or a unique interference pattern that only affected my specific receiver and recording setup. It was a plausible technical explanation, but it felt incomplete. The incident log was updated to include both events, noting the unusual radio transmission and the unexplained conveyor trip. The file was marked for further review, but no immediate action was deemed necessary. The port security chief made a brief visit to my cabin the next morning, asking a few procedural questions. He seemed satisfied with my report, but his gaze lingered on the VHF radio for a moment too long. After that night, the port returned to its usual rhythm. No more phantom broadcasts, no more unexplained conveyor trips. The incident was filed away, a minor anomaly in the vast logbook of port operations. I continued my night shifts, monitoring the systems, watching the freighters come and go. But the memory of that whispered list of names and the sudden, violent shudder of the conveyor stayed with me. I sometimes find myself listening more intently to the static on the VHF, straining to hear something beyond the normal hum of the port. The cold, the fog, the isolation of the night shift. They all feel a little different now. I still hear it sometimes, a faint, almost imperceptible whisper, just at the edge of hearing. I was a harbor technician, working the night shift along the Great Lakes shoreline. It was late winter, a cold night with a dense fog rolling in from the lake. That night, the first sign of something wrong was a slight flicker in the main dock floodlights. My shift began just before midnight. The air was still, barely above freezing, and the moisture in the atmosphere was already condensing into a thick, opaque blanket. I could hear the distant, flat tone of the foghorn from the main channel marker, a sound that usually brought a sense of routine. My job involved monitoring the port's infrastructure, checking security cameras, and performing physical patrols of the breakwalls and ore docks. The flickering floodlights were unusual. They pulsed with a subtle irregularity, not a full outage, but a brief dimming that lasted only a fraction of a second. I made a note in my logbook, attributing it to the cold or a minor grid fluctuation. The fog grew denser as I drove my utility truck along the gravel access roads. My headlights cut weak tunnels into the swirling vapor. The isolation of the night shift was a familiar comfort, but the increasing density of the fog began to press in, muting all sound and light. It felt heavier than usual, almost tactile. My routine involved a full circuit of the port facilities. This included a drive out to the end of the main breakwall, a long concrete and stone structure that jutted out into the lake. There, I would check the decommissioned range light, ensure the security cameras were clear of frost, and observe the channel for any unexpected vessel movements. It was a methodical process, designed to ensure everything remained operational and secure through the long, dark hours. The hum of the truck's engine and the static from the two-way radio were the only constant companions. I would often stop at the end of the breakwall just to listen to the lake, to feel the cold and to watch the fog move. The port was usually quiet at this hour, with most freighters either docked or far out on the open water. My shift notes typically recorded nothing more than temperature readings and observations about ice formation. I reached the end of the breakwall a little past 1 in the morning. The fog was so thick I could barely see the water's edge, even with the truck's high beams on. The air was still, heavy with the smell of damp concrete and lake water. I parked the truck, leaving the engine idling for warmth, and turned off the headlights. The only illumination came from the faint glow of the dash and the distant, diffused haze of the port's flood lamps struggling to penetrate the fog. I was preparing to step out and check the range light when I noticed the dash clock. It was a digital display, usually reliable, synchronized with the port's main server. As I watched, the numbers shifted. Not forward, as if catching up, but backward. The time displayed was exactly 5 minutes earlier than it had been just moments before. I stared at it, unblinking, trying to process what I was seeing. The clock then settled, holding the new, earlier time. I checked my phone, pulling it from my pocket. Its internal clock showed the correct time, the one I had seen on the dash just before the drift. I looked back at the truck's clock. It still showed the earlier time. A cold knot formed in my stomach. This was not a simple glitch. I tried to reset the truck's clock, but the system seemed unresponsive. It just held the drifted time. Then, my attention was drawn to the small sidelight on the decommissioned range light structure, about 20 yards ahead. It was a standard navigation light meant to pulse a steady green, but it was not steady. It was pulsing green, then green again, then red. Green, green, red. The sequence repeated, slow and deliberate, cutting through the dense fog. This was entirely wrong. A navigation light should never display a red pulse in that position. I grabbed my phone again, intending to record the light sequence as evidence. My hands felt clumsy in the cold cabin. I pointed the phone toward the light, hitting record. The green, green, red pulse continued, a silent, rhythmic beacon of something deeply amiss. I held the phone steady for about a minute, capturing the impossible pattern. The air outside the truck felt colder than before, even through the closed windows. A faint, high-pitched hum seemed to resonate through the metal of the truck's frame, a sound I couldn't place. It was subtle, almost subliminal, but it was there. I felt a prickle of unease on my skin. The fog seemed to press even closer, muffling the distant foghorn entirely. The world felt smaller, confined to the immediate vicinity of the truck and the strange, pulsing light. I finished the recording and lowered my phone. The light continued its wrong sequence. I tried to radio dispatch, but the VHF crackled with heavy static. I could hear fragments of voices, but nothing coherent. It was like trying to talk through a wall of white noise. This was highly unusual. The port's radio system was robust, designed to cut through interference. I tried again, pressing the transmit button, but only the static answered. The isolation felt absolute. I decided to get out and physically inspect the range light, despite the growing sense of dread. I grabbed my heavy flashlight and stepped out into the cold. The fog immediately enveloped me, thick and disorienting. The air was damp, clinging to my clothes. The ground felt solid under my boots, but the visibility was almost zero. I walked slowly toward the range light, guided by the pulsing green-red. The hum I had heard in the truck seemed to intensify slightly as I approached the structure. It was a low frequency, vibrating through the ground. I reached the base of the range light. The metal felt cold and damp under my gloved hand. I shone my flashlight up at the light fixture. It looked normal, no visible damage, no loose wiring. Yet, it continued its impossible sequence. I tried to access the control panel, but it was locked. I took a photograph of the light, hoping it would capture the color sequence more clearly than my phone video. The cold was seeping into my bones. I felt an irrational urge to run, to get back to the truck, but I forced myself to remain calm, to follow procedure. I returned to the truck, the strange hum seeming to recede as I moved away from the range light. The static on the radio was still present, making communication impossible. I tried calling dispatch on my cell phone. It rang through, but no one answered. This was even more concerning. Dispatch was always staffed. I checked the AIS system on the truck's laptop. It showed no vessels within a 20-mile radius, which was normal for this time of night. However, the system also displayed a series of minor sensor readouts that were flagged as anomalous. Temperature spikes in areas that should be stable, pressure drops in sealed conduits, and faint, unidentifiable audio signatures from the port's perimeter microphones. All of these were minor, easily dismissed as sensor errors. But together, they painted a picture of widespread, subtle disturbance. I reviewed the phone recording of the light. The video showed the green-red sequence clearly, but when I played the audio, there was nothing but the sound of wind. A steady, featureless rush of air, even though the night had been completely still. There was no hum, no distant foghorn, no sound of the lake, just wind. It was as if the microphone had filtered out everything else, or perhaps nothing else had been there to record. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. I started the truck and drove back along the breakwall, slowly, carefully, the fog still thick around me. I kept checking the dash clock. It remained 5 minutes behind. The range light, now behind me, continued its silent, wrong pulse. I eventually reached the main office, pulling into the parking lot just as the first hint of pre-dawn light began to diffuse through the fog. The static on the radio cleared as I got closer to the main antenna. I reported the incident to the morning shift supervisor, detailing the clock drift, the light sequence, the radio static, and the phone recording. He listened patiently, making notes. We reviewed the security camera footage from the breakwall. It showed my truck parked at the end, then me getting out and walking to the range light. The light itself appeared to be pulsing a normal green on the camera feed. There was no red. The timestamp on the video matched the correct time, not the drifted time from my dash. My phone video, however, clearly showed the green-red sequence. The supervisor attributed the discrepancy to a possible camera malfunction or a trick of the fog. He suggested the clock drift was an isolated electrical anomaly, perhaps a localized EMP burst from a passing vessel, though no vessels were recorded. The audio recording of just wind was dismissed as a common issue with phone microphones in dense fog. My report was filed, categorized as a series of minor equipment malfunctions. The range light was inspected later that day. It was found to be operating normally, no issues detected. The port's main server logs showed no record of any clock synchronization errors. I still work the night shift. The port has returned to its usual rhythm. The fog rolls in and out, The freighters pass, and the lights pulse as they should. But sometimes, when the fog is particularly dense and the night is especially quiet, I hear that faint, low hum. I check my dash clock more often now. I also find myself listening intently to the silence, trying to discern if the wind is truly all that is there. The memory of that green-red pulse remains. It feels like a whisper in the back of my mind, a quiet, persistent question. I was a harbor tech on the night shift. It was late winter, barely above freezing, with a thick fog rolling in. The automated shiploader controls showed an unexpected fault. The system flagged a motion interlock tripped on shiploader 3. This particular loader was cold, meaning it had been powered down for maintenance for the past week. Its boom was pinned in the stowed position, secured against the elements. My job involved monitoring the oar docks and the breakwalls, ensuring everything ran smoothly, or, more often, identifying why it wasn't. The fog was dense that night, muffling the usual sounds of the harbor. Even the distant foghorn had a flat, muted tone. I was in the main control cabin, a small, insulated space overlooking the vast, empty expanse of the oar yard. The air inside was warm, a stark contrast to the biting cold outside. My routine was usually quiet, especially during the late shift. I checked the AIS for vessel movements, scanned the security camera feeds, and logged any minor anomalies. The dock stretched for miles, a skeletal structure of steel and concrete, mostly silent in the winter months. Occasionally, a late freighter would arrive, pushing through the ice. But tonight the harbor was still. The only sounds were the low hum of the cabin's ventilation and the occasional static from the VHF radio. I would patrol the perimeter in my truck, its headlights cutting weak paths through the fog, illuminating patches of gravel and the frosted railings of the walkways. It was a job that required vigilance, but rarely demanded immediate action. The interlock fault on shiploader 3 was unusual. It indicated that the boom had moved, or at least, something had registered as movement. I pulled up the schematics and the last operational logs for the loader. Everything confirmed it was offline, its hydraulic lines drained, its power disconnected. I cross-referenced the fault with the yard camera feeds. Camera 7, positioned high on a light pole, covered the area around shiploader 3. The feed showed a swirling haze of fog, illuminated by the steady glow of the flood lamps. Nothing seemed out of place at first glance. I zoomed in, adjusting the contrast. That's when I saw it. A long, indistinct shadow, stretching across the deck hatches of the loader. It moved slowly, deliberately, from one side to the other. There was no crane above it, no vessel alongside, nothing that could cast such a shape. As the shadow passed, the flood lamps directly above the loader dimmed, then brightened again, a subtle flicker that was barely perceptible. It happened twice, coinciding with the shadow's movement. I rewound the footage, playing it back frame by frame. The shadow was elongated, almost like a boom, but it was too dark, too solid, to be a trick of the fog or light refraction. It had a defined edge, yet no discernible source. The vibration log for shiploader 3 also showed an entry. It read, "Walking load," a term used when a heavy, unbalanced load is being moved by the crane, causing structural resonance. But there was no load, no crane operating. and the loader was cold. The metal resonance I felt was not from the machine itself, but from the implication of the log entry. I radioed dispatch, reporting the anomaly. My voice sounded calm, even to myself, but a cold knot had formed in my stomach. Dispatch acknowledged the report, suggesting a sensor malfunction given the fog. I knew better. The dimming of the lights, the distinct shadow, the vibration log. These were not typical sensor glitches. I decided to investigate in person. I grabbed my heavy coat and a powerful flashlight, the beam cutting a solid tunnel through the thick air. The cold hit me immediately, a damp, penetrating chill that seeped into my bones. The ice hiss from the lake was a constant, low whisper in the background. My truck crunched over the gravel, its tires struggling for purchase on the frost-covered ground. The headlights barely penetrated the fog, creating a disorienting tunnel effect. I drove slowly, following the service trail that ran parallel to the docks. The isolation of the night shift felt heavier than usual. As I approached Shiploader 3, the structure loomed out of the mist, a dark, silent hulk. The flood lamps were steady now, casting their usual hazy glow. I parked a safe distance away and got out, the cold air biting at my exposed skin. The silence was profound, broken only by the distant, mournful wail of the foghorn. I walked toward the loader, my boots echoing faintly on the metal grating of the access stairs. The air felt sharper here, carrying the faint, metallic tang of the lake. I checked the interlock sensors, running a diagnostic from my handheld unit. They all read normal now. No fault detected. It was as if whatever had triggered them had simply vanished. I climbed the ladder to the operator's cabin, my flashlight beam sweeping across the controls. Everything was powered down, just as it should be. The boom was pinned, solid and unmoving. I ran my hand along the cold steel, feeling the frost that coated its surface. There was no evidence of recent movement, no scuff marks, no disturbed dust. I pulled out my camera, taking a series of photographs of the boom, the sensors, and the surrounding deck. These would go into the incident report. I then descended to the ground level, walking around the base of the loader. I checked the vibration sensors, noting their last readings. The walking load entry was still there, logged at the exact time the shadow had appeared on camera. It was a phantom event, recorded by the system but with no physical manifestation. I walked the length of the loader, my flashlight beam cutting through the fog, searching for anything. A footprint, a dropped tool, anything to explain the anomaly. There was nothing, just the cold, the fog, and the silent, massive machinery. I returned to the control cabin, the incident report already forming in my mind. I logged the details, the initial fault, the camera footage of the shadow and dimming lights, the walking load vibration entry, and my physical inspection confirming no visible cause. I attached the photographs to the digital file. Dispatch received my full report, and a maintenance crew was scheduled for the morning to conduct a thorough inspection of Shiploader 3's sensors and structural integrity. They found nothing. No faulty wiring, no damaged sensors, no structural stress. The official explanation in the logbook was environmental interference due to extreme fog conditions. I knew it was more than that. The memory of that shadow, moving with such deliberate slowness, remained vivid. I still think about that night sometimes. The way the fog swallowed the light, and the shadow moved without a source. The quiet dread of it stays with me, a cold whisper in the back of my mind. I was working the night shift as a harbor technician when the first call came in. The air outside was barely above freezing, and a thick fog had settled over the river mouth. A routine check of the outer breakwall cameras showed a flicker of something unusual near the decommissioned range marker. My job involved monitoring vessel traffic, maintaining shoreside equipment, and responding to any issues across the port facilities. The Great Lakes winter nights were long and often uneventful, marked by the low hum of distant machinery and the occasional flat tone of a foghorn. I would patrol the docks in a utility truck, checking security points and ensuring everything was secure against the cold and the elements. The river mouth was a critical point where the main shipping channel met the open lake, guarded by a long concrete breakwall and a series of navigation aids. Most of these aids were automated, but the old range markers, tall steel structures, still stood as silent sentinels, no longer active but part of the landscape. The initial report from the morning crew was simple enough. They had found a fresh paint stripe on the base of the old number 3 range marker, the one furthest out on the west breakwall. This marker had been out of service for years, its light removed, its purpose retired. The stripe was a bright, almost fluorescent orange, running vertically up the steel column from the snow line. It was a perfect center line, sharp and precise, as if applied with a professional sprayer. The oddity was that our paint shed, located back near the main office, had been locked all night, and its heaters were off, meaning any paint stored inside would have been too cold to spray effectively. Furthermore, no one on the night shift had been authorized to do any painting, especially not on a decommissioned marker. I received the call from dispatch just as the first hint of pre-dawn light began to diffuse through the heavy fog. The morning supervisor sounded perplexed, his voice a low static over the radio. He described the paint as still tacky to the touch, despite the cold. I confirmed that the paint shed had been secured and that no equipment had been signed out. The temperature had dipped below freezing for several hours before sunrise, making the fresh state of the paint even more peculiar. I told him I would head out to the breakwall to take a look myself, to document the anomaly with photographs and a detailed report. The gravel crunched under the tires of my utility truck as I drove towards the shoreline, the flood lamp haze cutting weak paths through the dense fog. The drive out to the breakwall was slow, visibility limited to a few truck lengths. The air was heavy with the scent of cold water and damp concrete. The foghorn's mournful blast echoed across the water at regular intervals, a sound that usually brought a sense of routine, but now felt like an underscore to something unsettling. I parked the truck near the base of the breakwall, the headlights barely penetrating the thick white curtain. The wind was light, but the cold bit through my heavy jacket. I walked along the concrete path, the sound of my boots muffled by the fog, the ice hiss from the lake barely audible. The number 3 range marker stood about a mile out, a dark silhouette against the gray-white backdrop. As I approached, the orange stripe became visible, a stark line against the weathered steel. It was exactly as described, a clean, vibrant stripe running from the snow-covered base upwards for about 6 feet. I reached out and touched it. The paint was indeed still slightly soft, yielding to the pressure of my gloved finger. This was impossible. Paint applied in these conditions should have been frozen solid, or at least hardened considerably. I took several photographs, documenting the stripe, the snow around the base, and the locked paint shed in the distance. I then noticed something else. The stripe was perfectly aligned with what would have been a navigation lane, if that lane still existed. This particular marker, when active, had guided vessels into a specific, dredged channel. However, the stripe extended beyond that, pointing towards an area of the river mouth that had not been dredged to shipping depth in decades. It was a shallow, rocky section, impassable for any large vessel. I pulled out my handheld GPS unit and confirmed the bearing. The alignment was precise, almost unnervingly so, considering the marker's decommissioned status. I spent about an hour at the site, walking the perimeter, looking for any tracks in the fresh snow. There were none, only my own boot prints. The snow was undisturbed, a smooth, unbroken blanket around the base of the marker. No footprints, no tire tracks, nothing to indicate anyone had been there to apply the paint. I checked the security cameras again from my truck's monitor. The camera covering that section of the breakwall showed nothing but fog and the occasional gust of wind. The audio mics picked up only the foghorn and the lapping of water. There was no sound of a sprayer, no vehicle, no human presence. Back at the main office, I filed my report, attaching the photographs. The supervisor reviewed it, his brow furrowed. He agreed it made no sense. We checked the AIS logs for the entire night. No vessels had entered or exited the port during the hours the paint would have been applied. The only traffic had been a small fishing tug, well offshore, and a Coast Guard cutter on routine patrol, both far from the breakwall. We also reviewed the shift notes from the previous night. Nothing unusual was reported. The sensor readouts for temperature and wind speed confirmed the conditions I had observed. The alignment of the stripe bothered me the most. It pointed directly towards the shallow, undredged section of the river mouth. Out of curiosity, and perhaps a growing sense of unease, I decided to take a small survey boat out later that day. The fog had lifted somewhat, though the sky remained overcast. I navigated to the point where the painted line would have intersected the water, a few hundred yards offshore. I deployed a portable fish finder, a device typically used to locate schools of fish, but also capable of mapping bottom contours. The initial readings were as expected, a gradual slope, then a sharp rise, indicating the rocky, shallow bottom. But as I moved the boat slowly along the projected line of the paint stripe, the fish finder screen showed something else. There was a distinct, solid return, an unexpected elevation on the riverbed, directly in line with the painted marker. It was not a natural rock formation. The shape on the screen was too uniform, too defined. It appeared to be a large, submerged object, resting on the bottom, about 30 feet down. The depth here was barely enough for a small pleasure craft, certainly not for any commercial vessel. I made several passes, confirming the reading. The object was substantial, perhaps about 50 feet long and 20 feet wide. It was not something that should have been there. I checked the hydrographic charts. No known wrecks or significant underwater features were marked in that precise location. I logged the coordinates and the fish finder data, adding it to my report. The implications were unsettling. Someone had painted a navigation line on a decommissioned marker, pointing to an impassable lane. And that lane now contained an unknown, submerged object. The harbor master reviewed my updated report. He was a man of few words, but I could see the concern in his eyes. He authorized a full sonar scan of the area to be conducted by a specialized survey team. The results of that scan were never fully disclosed to me. I was told only that the object was unidentifiable and not a threat to navigation. The paint stripe on the range marker was eventually painted over with a standard gray a few weeks later. The incident was filed away, a strange anomaly in the harbor logbook. I still work the night shift, patrolling the docks. The fog still rolls in, and the foghorn still sounds its low, flat tone. Sometimes when the night is particularly still, I think about that paint stripe and the object beneath the water. I wonder what it was, and how it got there. I wonder who painted that line, and why. The answers never came, and the silence of the night offers no whisper of explanation. I was the night shift harbor tech, tasked with digitizing old safety briefs. It was late winter, the air barely above freezing, and a thick fog had rolled in. That night, a cassette labeled from years ago played back details of the current weather and a specific tow. My routine in the harbor office was usually quiet, a steady hum of machines, and the distant flat tone of the foghorn. I monitored vessel traffic, logged arrivals and departures, and kept an eye on the security cameras. The job involved long stretches of isolation, especially during the colder months, when the ore docks were less active. Part of my duties included archiving old audio recordings, transferring them from cassette to digital files. These tapes held decades of harbor communications, safety drills, and weather reports. It was a tedious but necessary task, ensuring historical data was preserved. The office itself was functional, filled with older equipment, its windows looking out onto the dark, metal-resonant expanse of the Great Lakes. I picked up a cassette from a stack marked for processing. The label, handwritten and faded, indicated it was a safety brief from a decade prior. I inserted it into the old deck, the plastic clicking into place. A faint static preceded the audio, a common artifact of aging magnetic tape. Then, a voice began to speak, calm and clear. It described weather conditions, the kind of dense fog that pressed against the office windows, reducing the flood lamp haze to a dull glow. It mentioned ice forming near the breakwall, a detail that resonated with the current night's conditions. The voice continued, giving precise instructions. It stated, "Tug Orion standing by for the Northern Star at 0300 hours. Towpath cleared for the West Channel." A cold jolt went through me. The Orion was indeed out there, waiting. The Northern Star, a bulk freighter, was due to arrive in a few hours. I checked the current harbor log on my screen. The Orion's AS transistor showed its position, idling near the channel entrance. The Northern Star was on approach. The details from the tape were not just similar, they were exact, specific to this very night. I paused the playback, my hand hovering over the controls. The cassette was clearly labeled with an old date, a date from long before tonight. I rewound the tape a little, then pressed play again. The voice repeated the same information, the same specific tow times, the same vessel names, the same weather. The static on the tape seemed to whisper around the words, a faint hiss beneath the factual delivery. The logical impossibility of it settled over me, a quiet dread in the otherwise silent office. The foghorn outside sounded again, a mournful, flat tone cutting through the night. The cold in the room felt sharper, despite the heating. My first impulse was to verify the information. I contacted the tug Orion via VHF radio. The tug master, a man named Miller, responded promptly. I asked him to confirm his current instructions and the expected tow time for the Northern Star. He confirmed the details, stating he was indeed standing by for the freighter at the precise time the voice on the tape had mentioned. He added that dispatch had relayed the instructions to him a little while ago. I did not mention the cassette. I simply acknowledged his confirmation and ended the transmission. I then pulled up the dispatch logs for the shift. The instructions for the Orion had been sent out, matching what Miller had told me. The issue was not the information itself, but its presence on a decade-old recording. I returned to the AIS tracking system, focusing on the Orion's recent movements. The tug had been idling, as expected, but then its breadcrumb trail showed a brief, subtle deviation. For about 3 minutes, the vessel had moved slightly off its designated waiting area, veering towards an older, decommissioned range light near a section of the breakwall known for early ice formation. It was a small detour, perhaps a few hundred yards, but it was distinct. I called Miller again. I asked him if he had made any minor course adjustments or detours from his holding pattern. There was a pause on the radio, then a slight crackle of static. He sounded confused, then mildly irritated. He insisted he had maintained his position, that his GPS was showing him steady. I described the AIS breadcrumbs, the short, curved trail away from the main channel. He reiterated his denial, stating his equipment was accurate and he had not moved. I then accessed the security camera feeds. The fog was incredibly dense, reducing visibility to a few dozen yards. I could barely make out the faint glow of the Orion's headlights through the haze. As I reviewed the footage from the time of the AIS deviation, the tug's lights seemed to waver, briefly disappearing into the thickest part of the fog, then reappearing on the correct path. The visual evidence was inconclusive due to the weather, but the AIS track remained clear. It showed the tug had indeed moved. The discrepancy between the digital data, the tugmaster's firm denial, and the ambiguous camera footage was unsettling. I documented everything meticulously in the shift notes, creating a detailed report of the unusual audio, the AIS anomaly, and the radio exchanges. The cold in the office seemed to deepen, and the static on the radio, even when no one was speaking, seemed to hum with a low, persistent energy. The Northern Star arrived safely, guided by the Orion through the channel. No official incident report was filed by the tugmaster regarding any detour or the unusual radio call from me. My own report, detailing the strange audio and the AIS discrepancy, was flagged for review by the morning supervisor. The old cassette was examined. When I tried to replay the specific section for them, it was just static, or an unrelated, garbled old recording. The supervisor listened patiently, then dismissed it as a combination of a faulty player, tape degradation, and perhaps a tired mind on my part. The archived AIS data for that specific time, showing the brief, inexplicable deviation, remained in the system, an unexplained anomaly. The feeling of isolation from that night, however, lingered. I still work the night shift in the harbor office. The hum of the machines, the distant foghorn, and the persistent cold are constant companions. Sometimes, when the static builds on the radio, or the fog presses particularly hard against the windows, I hear it. Not the words themselves, but the specific, flat tone of that voice. It is a whisper of something that should not have been, a moment out of time. The memory of that voice, describing a night that was still unfolding, stays with me. I was on the night shift, monitoring the river mouth from the harbor office. It was late winter, the air barely above freezing, and a thick fog had settled over the water. That night, an unusual vibration started to register on the structural integrity sensors for the main breakwall. My job involved overseeing the automated systems and making rounds of the docks. I checked the security cameras, scanned the AIS for vessel traffic, and logged the environmental data. The river was mostly skim ice, a thin, fragile crust extending from the shore towards the deeper channel. A decommissioned ore barge, the Mariner's Rest, was moored about a mile upstream, awaiting salvage. It had been there for months, a silent hulk against the industrial skyline. The vibration continued, a low, persistent hum that the sensors picked up, but I could not yet feel. It was just a data spike, an anomaly in the usual background noise of the harbor. The fog outside was so dense that the flood lamps cast only a limited haze, barely illuminating the nearest pilings. I checked the river current monitors, but everything seemed normal. The data indicated a subtle, rhythmic pressure against the breakwall's submerged sections. I made a note in the digital logbook, flagging the unusual reading for the morning crew. The night was long and quiet. Usually. My routine was predictable, a rhythm of checks and reports. I would patrol the perimeter in the utility vehicle, its headlights cutting through the night, illuminating the gravel paths. Then, I would return to the warmth of the main cabin, reviewing the feeds from the various cameras and environmental sensors. The radio would sometimes crackle with distant dispatch calls, but mostly it was silent. The cold was a constant companion during these shifts, seeping into the metal of the docks and the concrete of the breakwalls. I knew the sounds of the harbor intimately. The groan of shifting ice, the distant foghorn's flat tone, the occasional clang of metal from a moored vessel. This was a place of industry and solitude, especially after midnight. The river mouth was a critical point, a gateway to the larger lake, and my vigilance was paramount. I often felt a deep sense of isolation out there, surrounded by the dark water and the silent, hulking structures. Around 1:15, the hum intensified. It was no longer just a sensor reading. I could feel it now, a subtle resonance through the floor of the cabin. I checked the external audio microphones. The sound was faint at first, a low, two-tone wail, almost like a distant emergency siren, but muffled, as if coming from underwater. It was not a sound I recognized from any vessel or shore facility. The AIS showed no traffic within several miles. I zoomed the cameras on the Mariner's Rest. The barge sat motionless, its dark silhouette barely visible through the persistent fog. The sound grew steadily louder, a slow, deliberate approach. It was a deep, resonant tone, then a higher, piercing note, alternating in a hypnotic, unsettling rhythm. The audio meters on my console began to spike, indicating a significant increase in decibels. I could hear it clearly now, even without the microphones. a sound that seemed to vibrate through the very structure of the harbor. It was coming from the river, moving upstream towards the barge. The skim ice on the river surface began to show faint ripples, emanating from a point beneath the ice, moving with the sound. I grabbed a handheld thermal imager and stepped outside onto the observation deck. The cold air bit at my exposed skin. The fog was still thick, but I could make out the general direction. The sound was directly beneath the ice, moving slowly, steadily. It was a chilling, mechanical wail, yet it carried an organic quality, like something alive. The thermal imager showed nothing beneath the ice, only the uniform cold signature of the water. As the sound approached the Mariner's Rest, the audio meters peaked. The two-tone wail was now loud enough to feel in my chest, a deep, unsettling vibration. I watched the barge through the camera feed. The flood lamps on the dock cast a hazy light onto its deck. Then I saw it. A thin layer of frost began to form on the barge's metal deck, not uniformly, but in distinct, concentric rings. They appeared quickly, almost instantly, starting from the center of the deck and expanding outwards, then fading, only to reform again. Each ring of frost coincided precisely with the alternating tones of the siren. The metal resonance of the barge itself seemed to amplify the sound, turning it into a physical presence. The ice hiss from the river surface around the barge intensified, a constant, low crackling sound. The siren circled the Mariner's Rest slowly, a full rotation, the frost rings appearing and disappearing with each pass. The sound was deafening on the audio feed, a relentless, two-note cry that seemed to penetrate everything. I felt a profound sense of dread, a cold, creeping fear that had nothing to do with the temperature. This was not a vessel. This was not a known phenomenon. It was something else entirely, moving unseen beneath the ice, announcing its presence with that terrible, rhythmic wail and the strange, ephemeral frost. The circling continued for what felt like several minutes, the sound meter holding at its maximum, the frost rings forming and dissolving on the barge deck. I tried to contact the Coast Guard on the VHF radio, but all I got was static. The frequency was clear, but my transmissions seemed to vanish into the fog. I tried the backup channel, then the emergency channel, with the same result. It was as if something was jamming the signal. Or perhaps the sheer intensity of the sound was interfering with the electronics. I checked the AIS again, confirming no vessels were registered in the area. The security cameras offered no visual confirmation of a source, only the rippling ice and the strange frost patterns on the barge. I reviewed the sensor readouts. The structural integrity sensors for the breakwall were still registering the low hum. But now the river current sensors were showing minor, localized fluctuations around the Mariner's Rest. It was not a strong current, but a subtle, rhythmic disturbance, consistent with something large moving slowly beneath the surface. I pulled up the historical data for the barge. It had been listing slightly to port for weeks, a minor issue noted in the harbor logs, awaiting a more thorough inspection. The siren's wail began to recede, slowly, gradually. The audio meters dropped, the resonance in the cabin lessened. The frost rings on the Mariner's Rest deck became fainter, less distinct, until they vanished entirely. The ice hiss around the barge also subsided. The sound moved back downriver, fading into the distance, its two-tone cry becoming softer, more muffled, until it was gone completely. The silence that followed was profound, almost oppressive. The only sounds were the distant, normal hum of the harbor machinery, and the gentle lapping of water against the pilings. I stepped back outside. The fog was still thick, the air still cold. I scanned the river with the thermal imager one last time. Nothing. The skim ice was undisturbed, smooth and unbroken. I went back inside, my hands shaking slightly. I pulled up the camera feed for the Mariner's Rest again. The barge was still there, dark and silent. But something was different. I cross-referenced the current camera view with a photograph from earlier in the night, taken during my routine checks. The Mariner's Rest was no longer listing to port. Its deck appeared level, its hull sitting evenly in the water. The list had corrected itself. I checked the structural integrity sensors one last time. The low hum was gone. The river current sensors were back to normal, showing no unusual fluctuations. I spent the next hour reviewing all the data, cross-referencing every log entry, every sensor readout. There was no explanation for the sound, no source for the frost, and certainly no reason for the barge to have righted itself. I compiled a detailed report attaching the audio recordings and the sensor data. The incident was unprecedented in my years on the night shift. The morning crew arrived, and I briefed my supervisor. He reviewed my report, listened to the audio, and examined the sensor logs. He looked at the before and after photographs of the Mariner's Rest. There was no immediate explanation. The Coast Guard was notified, and a small team conducted a visual inspection of the barge and the surrounding riverbed later that day. They found nothing unusual. No signs of impact, no debris, no evidence of any submerged object. The Mariner's Rest remained perfectly level. The official report filed by the harbor authorities noted an unidentified acoustic anomaly and unexplained structural stabilization of the barge. My detailed notes, including the observations of the frost rings, were appended to the file as supplementary evidence. The incident was logged, investigated, and ultimately closed without resolution. The cold, quiet dread of that night lingered with me, a persistent whisper in the back of my mind. I continued working the night shift for several more years, but I never heard the two-tone wail again. The Mariner's Rest was eventually towed away for salvage, its mystery unresolved. Sometimes, on particularly foggy nights, when the river is quiet and the ice is forming, I find myself listening. I listen for that specific resonant hum, that low, two-tone siren. The memory of it still feels cold, a sound that came from nowhere and left no trace, except for a perfectly level barge and a deep, unsettling silence. I was monitoring the harbor systems that night. A routine shift like any other. The air was barely above freezing, thick with a damp fog rolling in from the lake. Then, a faint audio spike registered from the gantry catwalk microphone, an area that should have been silent. My role as a harbor systems technician involved overseeing the automated functions and security feeds for the port's various facilities. This included the ore docks, breakwalls, and decommissioned range lights along the shoreline. It was a solitary job, especially during the winter months when the lake traffic slowed to a crawl. The main control cabin, where I worked, sat elevated, offering a wide but often obscured view of the berths. The foghorn's flat tone was a constant companion on nights like this, a low hum that vibrated through the glass. The gantry catwalk in question was part of an older loading system, mostly inactive, leading out over one of the deep ore pockets. It was equipped with a basic audio pickup, a relic from an earlier security upgrade. The spike was brief, just a blip on the waveform, but it was enough to catch my attention. I zoomed the nearest security camera to the gantry, but the flood lamp haze made it difficult to discern anything clearly. The static on the feed was heavier than usual, a common issue. I made a mental note to check the system logs later, assuming it was just interference. My shift typically ran from late evening until dawn, a period of quiet observation. Most of the heavy machinery was powered down, leaving only the low thrum of the generators and the distant sounds of the lake. I would cycle through camera feeds, check sensor readouts, and log any minor anomalies. The harbor was a place of immense scale, but during the night it felt strangely intimate, almost deserted. The cold was a constant presence, seeping into the cabin despite the heaters. I often walked the perimeter during my breaks, feeling the crunch of gravel under my boots, watching the occasional headlights of a passing vehicle on the highway. My routine was built on predictability, on the absence of the unexpected. Any deviation, no matter how small, stood out against that backdrop of quiet efficiency. I relied on the systems to tell me if something was out of place, to break the isolation of the night. About an hour after the initial audio spike, it happened again. This time, the sound was clearer, more distinct. It was a rhythmic, deliberate series of steps, a heel-to-toe cadence echoing on the metal grating of the gantry catwalk. I isolated the audio feed, turning up the volume in the cabin. The sound was unmistakable. Heavy work boots, slowly traversing the catwalk. My eyes went to the gantry camera monitor. The flood lamps cast long, distorted shadows, but I could see no figure. The catwalk stretched out, a skeletal structure against the dense fog, leading to a dead-end ladder that descended into the ore pocket. There was no reason for anyone to be out there, especially not at this hour. The area was secured, and all personnel were accounted for in the shift notes. I checked the AIS system for unexpected vessel movements. The screen showed only stationary freighters, their transponders broadcasting positions. The VHF radio was silent, save for the occasional burst of static. The steps continued, slow and measured, moving steadily toward the ladder. I could hear the faint metallic resonance with each footfall, a sound that seemed to carry through the very structure of the dock. It was a sound of weight, of solid contact. I pulled up the schematics for the gantry section. The catwalk was about 3 feet wide, made of heavy-gauge steel grating. The ladder at the end was a maintenance access point, rarely used, and always locked. The steps reached the very end of the catwalk, right at the base of the ladder. Then they stopped. There was a moment of silence, broken only by the distant foghorn. I held my breath, listening intently. After a few seconds, I heard a faint metallic clink, like something small being dropped. It was followed by a low, almost imperceptible hum, a sound I couldn't immediately identify. I rewound the audio feed, playing it back several times. The steps were undeniably there, clear and resonant. The clink was also clear. I cross-referenced the security camera feed with the audio, trying to pinpoint the exact location. The camera showed nothing, just the empty catwalk, shrouded in the floodlamp haze. I checked the environmental sensors for the gantry. No unusual vibrations, no sudden temperature drops. Nothing that would indicate a physical presence. The air felt colder in the cabin, despite the heat. I felt a prickle of unease. This wasn't just static or a faulty sensor. This was a distinct, audible event, recorded by the system. The lack of visual confirmation, combined with the absence of any other sensor data, created a profound sense of wrongness. The silence that followed the dropped object felt heavier than the previous sounds. It was the silence of something having just been there. I logged the incident in the harbor report, detailing the audio anomaly and the lack of visual confirmation. My shift notes were always precise, a habit ingrained from procedural work. I then contacted dispatch, giving them a concise summary of what I had observed. They acknowledged the report, suggesting an electrical ghost or stray animal. I knew it wasn't. The sound had been too deliberate, too human. I requested a perimeter check of the gantry area, but due to the heavy fog and minimal personnel on duty, it would be some time before anyone could physically inspect it. I spent the next hour reviewing the archived footage and audio from the gantry. The steps were consistent in their rhythm and apparent weight. The dropped object sound was also consistent. I decided to take a closer look myself, despite the fog. I grabbed my heavy coat, a powerful flashlight, and my radio, informing dispatch. The cold hit me immediately stepping out of the cabin. The gravel crunched under my boots as I walked toward the gantry access road. The fog was so dense that floodlights seemed to dissolve, creating halos of diffused light. The hum of the distant generators was muffled, and the ice hiss from the lake was barely audible. Reaching the base of the gantry, I ascended the first set of stairs, my flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. The metal felt cold and damp under my gloved hand. I moved slowly, listening for sounds beyond my own footsteps. The catwalk stretched before me, a long, narrow path of grating. I walked its length, my beam sweeping across the surface. There was a fine layer of powder rust on the grating, undisturbed. No footprints, no scuff marks. Nothing to indicate passage. I reached the dead-end ladder. It was still locked, the padlock cold and stiff. I ran my hand over the rungs. The same fine layer of powder rust coated them. Then I saw it. Near the base of the ladder, nestled in the grating, was a small hexagonal nut. It was a standard size, likely from one of the gantry's older mechanisms. I knelt, shining my light directly on it. The nut was spinning. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, it rotated in place, a tiny silent gyre. There was no wind, no gantry vibration, no discernible force causing movement. The entire structure was still, silent and cold. I reached out, my fingers brushing the metal grating around it. Nothing. The nut continued its slow, impossible rotation. I took a photograph with my phone, the flash momentarily blinding in the fog. I then carefully picked up the nut, feeling its cold, smooth surface. It stopped spinning the moment I touched it. I radioed dispatch again, my voice less steady than before. I described the undisturbed rust in the spinning nut. There was a pause on the other end. A moment of silence before the dispatcher acknowledged my report with a strained tone. They said they would send a patrol car from the local authorities, the RCMP, to investigate the area more thoroughly. I waited by the gantry, the cold seeping into my bones. The fog seemed to press in closer, and the night's isolation felt absolute. The RCMP patrol arrived about an hour later, 2 officers emerging from the fog, their headlights cutting through the gloom. I showed them the gantry, explained the audio recordings, and presented the nut. They examined the catwalk and the ladder, confirming the undisturbed rust. One officer took the nut, placing it in an evidence bag. They walked the length of the gantry, their flashlights sweeping the empty space. Their report, which I later saw in the official file, noted unexplained audio anomaly and absence of physical evidence of trespass. The nut was logged as found object, origin undetermined. No further action was taken. The incident was closed. I returned to the cabin, the quiet hum of the systems feeling different. The cold seemed to linger, a subtle chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. I still work the night shift, still monitor the harbor systems. The gantry catwalk microphone was eventually replaced, but the old audio logs remain in the archives. Sometimes, on a particularly foggy night, when the foghorn sounds its flat tone and the static is heavy on the radio, I think about those steps. I think about the undisturbed powder rust and the small nut spinning in place against no vibration. I still hear it sometimes, a faint, rhythmic cadence, just at the edge of hearing, echoing on metal that should be silent. I was on the night shift as a harbor operations technician. It was late winter, and a thick fog had rolled in from the lake. That night, the routine check of the decommissioned range light hut revealed something wrong. My duties involved monitoring vessel traffic and maintaining shore-based navigation aids. The range light hut was a small square structure, no longer active, but still part of our regular patrol. It sat on a concrete breakwall, exposed to the full force of the Great Lakes weather. The structure was about a mile out from the main dock, accessible by a narrow service road. I drove the utility vehicle along the gravel path, its headlights cutting weak beams through the dense fog. The air was barely above freezing, and a thin layer of frost coated everything. The foghorn sounded its flat, mournful tone every few minutes, a constant presence in the isolation of the night. I pulled up to the hut, the vehicle's engine idling softly. My flashlight beam found the hut door. It was painted a fresh, bright yellow, a recent maintenance job completed only a few days prior. Across the new paint, I saw distinct, fresh pry marks. They were deep gouges in the wood, clearly made with a tool. The marks were raw, splintered wood showing through the new yellow. This was not old damage. Someone had tried to force the door open very recently. My routine involved checking all remote facilities. This included the range hut, several weather stations, and various sensor arrays. I would log their status, perform minor repairs, and ensure security. The night shift was usually quiet, especially in winter. Most vessels were laid up in the marina. The occasional freighter would pass through the shipping lanes, its presence tracked on our AIS system. The hum of the radio was a constant companion in the main cabin. I often spent hours alone, monitoring screens and listening to the static. The isolation was part of the job. It required a certain temperament. I knew every creak of the breakwall, every shift in the wind. I knew the sounds of the lake. I also knew the security protocols for every structure. The range hut had been secured with a new, heavy-duty padlock after its recent paint job. The paint had been applied by our own crew. No one else should have been near it. The pry marks were a clear violation. I got out of the vehicle, the cold air biting at my exposed skin. The metal resonance of the breakwall under my boots was sharp. I approached the door cautiously, my flashlight beam sweeping the area. There were no footprints in the thin frost on the concrete. The gravel around the hut was undisturbed. I checked the padlock. It was still in place, completely intact. The shackle was closed, the keyway sealed. This made no sense. Someone had tried to pry the door open, but they had not succeeded. The door itself was solid wood, reinforced with steel plating on the inside. It would take considerable effort to force. I radioed dispatch, reporting the damage. They advised me to photograph the scene and wait for a supervisor. I took several photographs with my work-issued camera, documenting the fresh marks against the new paint. The supervisor arrived about an hour later, driving a larger utility truck. The fog had thinned slightly, but visibility remained poor. We examined the door together. He confirmed the marks were recent. He also noted the intact padlock. This was puzzling. He decided we needed to open the hut and check for internal damage or entry. He had the master key. He unlocked the padlock, the mechanism clicking loudly in the quiet night. He pulled the heavy door open. I shone my flashlight inside. The hut was small, perhaps 10 feet by 10 feet. It contained old electrical conduits, a few decommissioned instruments, and a thick layer of dust. The dust was undisturbed. There were no footprints on the floor. No signs of forced entry from the inside. Nothing was out of place. It was as if someone had tried to get in from the outside, failed, and then vanished. We checked the small barred window. It was sealed and secure. The roof showed no signs of tampering. The supervisor made a note in his logbook. He then instructed me to install a temporary security camera and an audio recorder inside the hut. This was standard procedure for any security breach, even an attempted one. I retrieved the equipment from my vehicle. The camera was a small battery-powered unit with night vision. The audio recorder was a sensitive microphone designed to pick up subtle sounds. I mounted the camera in a corner, pointing towards the door. I placed the audio recorder on a shelf. We secured the hut again, the new padlock clicking into place. The next morning, I returned to retrieve the equipment. The fog had lifted, revealing a clear, cold day. The sun glinted off the ice, forming along the breakwall. I unlocked the hut and removed the camera and recorder. Back at the main office, I uploaded the data. The camera footage showed nothing. The interior of the hut remained still and empty for the entire night. The dust on the floor was still unbroken. Then I played the audio recording. It was mostly ambient sound, The distant foghorn, the faint hum of the lake, the occasional hiss of ice shifting. I fast-forwarded through the uneventful hours. Then, at a point about an hour before sunrise, I heard it. 2 distinct knocks. They were not loud, but clear. They sounded like someone rapping on wood. The sound came from inside the hut. I replayed the segment several times. There was no mistaking it. 2 deliberate knocks. I checked the camera footage again for that exact time. The camera showed the empty interior. Nothing moved. Nothing entered or exited. The dust on the floor remained undisturbed. The door was still closed and locked from the outside. The knocks had come from within an empty, sealed space. I immediately called my supervisor. He came down to the control room. I played the audio for him. He listened intently, his expression unreadable. He asked me to confirm the camera footage for the same time frame. I showed him the blank, static interior. He reviewed the logbook entry from the previous night, confirming the hut had been locked and secured. He checked the maintenance records for the door, verifying the fresh paint and the internal steel reinforcement. We spent the next few hours reviewing everything. We checked the external security cameras that covered the breakwall. There was a gull cam mounted on a nearby pole, designed to monitor bird activity, but it also captured a wide view of the hut's exterior. We reviewed its footage from the entire night. No one approached the hut. No one left the hut. The area around the structure remained empty and still. The fog had been thick, but the camera's infrared vision was effective. There was no human presence. We considered every possibility. Animal activity? Unlikely to produce such distinct, deliberate knocks. A structural shift? The hut was solid concrete and wood, built to withstand lake storms. The sound was too precise, too rhythmic. A malfunction of the audio recorder? We tested the unit. It functioned perfectly. We even tried knocking on the inside of the hut door ourselves, comparing the sound. The recorded knocks matched the sound of rapping on the wooden door from the inside. My supervisor contacted the local authorities. A sheriff's deputy arrived later that afternoon. He was a quiet man, accustomed to strange calls from the docks. We presented all the evidence. The photographs of the pry marks, the intact padlock, the undisturbed dust, the camera footage showing an empty interior, and the audio recording of the knocks. He listened to the recording several times. He walked out to the hut with us, examining the door and the interior. He found nothing new. He noted the lack of any entry or exit points. He noted the lack of any physical evidence. The deputy filed a report. He classified it as an unexplained incident. He suggested it might be a prank, though he admitted the lack of any physical evidence made that difficult to prove. He also mentioned the possibility of some kind of acoustic anomaly, though he could not explain how. He advised us to increase patrols in the area. We did. For the next few nights, I made extra trips out to the range hut. I installed more sensors, motion detectors, and even a thermal camera. Nothing. The hut remained silent and empty. The dust inside remained unbroken. The incident was logged in the harbor's security file. It was an open case, but with no leads. The pry marks were eventually sanded down and repainted. The new security measures remained in place. The official report concluded with no definitive explanation. The incident was marked as an anomaly. My shift notes from that period are filled with observations about the weather, the lake conditions, and the status of the hut. I kept a close watch on the area for weeks, Nothing else occurred. The quiet dread, however, lingered. It was not a fear of what might happen, but a discomfort with what had already happened. The facts did not align. The evidence contradicted itself. I still perform my duties, patrolling the breakwall and checking the navigation aids. The range hut is just another structure now, its yellow door gleaming in the sun or fading into the fog. But I remember the sound. I remember the two distinct knocks. They came from a place that was empty, sealed, and silent. The memory of that sound is a constant undercurrent. It reminds me that some things simply do not fit into any logical framework. The quiet hum of the control room radio sometimes shifts, and for a moment, I hear it again. The sound of wood on wood, from an impossible space. I still check the hut's status on the remote sensors, even when it is not part of my direct patrol. I sometimes drive past it on my way home, the headlights briefly illuminating its yellow door. The isolation of the night can play tricks, but this was recorded. I still hear it sometimes.